Shepard.
That's all for now.
Shepard. Shepard.
That's all for now.
Shepard. Shepard.
That's all for now.
Shepard.
Hey everyone, we continue ranking every Mass Effect game with the help of my Stasocritic scoring system. Even though I played Mass Effect 1 for the first time more than a decade after its release, it has managed to become one of my most favorite games. I've completed it twice in a row to boot. Its world building that set the foundation of the game's atmosphere and plot is just that good, even if the gameplay was really flawed. Now it's time to discuss Mass Effect 2. Mass Effect 2 fails as a sequel. Don't get me wrong, it's a great game. Mass Effect 2 is epic, dramatic, breathtaking, and plays much better than its predecessor. Gone is the awkward targeting, ridiculous bullet spread, barely working cover system, and stupid AI. Cover and shoot mechanics are snappy and satisfying, every weapon has varying firing mode behaviors and advantages against different barrier types, shield, armor, and biotic. And as enemies have various combinations of those, you're also encouraged to switch between weapons more often. It's still a bit too restrictive for a third-person shooter. For example, you can't vault over surfaces that by all means should be vaultable, and sometimes the cover system or general navigation just bugs out, but the moment-to-moment gameplay is much more engaging. Combat now utilizes a traditional ammo system where clips are contextualized as hitsinks to somewhat fit lore-wise with weapons from Mass Effect 1. As a result, even basic fights feel more dynamic since you have to move around arenas to pick up the spawn and thermal clips. These arenas, as well as the levels they're in, are far more varied not just in terms of locations and settings, but also pacing and environmental interactable objects. Some missions are more suspenseful, some are just a single action-packed arena, some involve mini-bosses. I wouldn't say every level is a masterpiece, but there's rarely a dull moment, even in the short side missions and optional planets, some of which might not have any combat at all. But to achieve this quite impressive variety, Mass Effect 2 has sacrificed the aspect of exploration. Most levels outside of a couple hubs are very linear with some small optional rooms or corridors that house resources or upgrade blueprints. While level design is definitely more enjoyable than the repetitive warehouses of Mass Effect 1, the world can feel a bit more gamey and less connected, especially with the removal of Mako sections. There are vehicle segments added in DLC, but they are more about platforming than anything. By the way, I won't discuss any DLC separately. Outside of the weapon and armor ones, they're integrated very well into the main campaign and share most of the base game's strengths and weaknesses, both in terms of gameplay and narrative. There's no loot to speak of and no inventory management, all part of overall streamlining of the RPG systems and conventions. In terms of equipment, you don't have to worry about anything other than weapon loadouts and how your characters look, while the amount of skills has been greatly reduced. Everyone has only one passive skill and 3 active ones, with the exception of Shepard, who has 6 active skills. This limits the amount of customization and style tweaking you can do, but also it's faster to use skills and the effect of each upgrade is more visible. Since every squad mate is more specialized, selecting team compositions is more straightforward. And you aren't punished for not having someone with a particular skill. For example, hacking is universal, plus the 2 related minigames are more engaging than the one from previous Mass Effect. The way all the mechanics have been streamlined might not be favorable for RPG fans, however, since RPG and gameplay systems in the original Mass Effect weren't particularly great in the first place, I see where Mass Effect 2 is coming from with its desire to minimize the amount of time spent in menus. But considering that, I also don't understand why Mass Effect 2 has changed the snappy galaxy travel and scanning mechanics from the first game into boring minigames where you have to manually move the Normandy around to then scan all over the planet for resources or missions with probes. You will have to do that a lot, a bunch of upgrades are quite resource intensive. At least we get a Uranus joke out of this.
Uranus.
But overall, the streamlining does reach its goals. Between interplanetary travel, it does feel like much more time is spent not only fighting, but talking as well. Definitely helps that cutscene and conversation animation systems are far more advanced than in the first game. Characters feel more alive, the direction is more interesting, while lighting and animation quality overall is better. This doesn't mean that there aren't any visual drawbacks. Some of them are aesthetic in nature, like the, let's call it, weird clothing style of several characters, or the camera shots that choose to focus on a teammate's personality. Others are more technical, like how the walking animation that looks fine in armor is absolutely weird when wearing a dress. But overall, the game's visuals are better and more dynamic, especially during conversations. There's a very nice addition in the form of Paragon and Renegade interrupts, which you can activate during cutscenes. Though Mass Effect 2 didn't really bring more clarity into the distinction between Paragon and Renegade paths. At least there's far less stupid Renegade choices now. And while there are some incredibly aggressive Renegade options,
I've got nothing more to say to you. If you shoot me, my team's right through.
How about goodbye?
it is not uncommon for a Renegade to be supportive and for a Paragon to be harsh and aggressive, but with more pragmatic or idealistic reasons behind it, I suppose. This is why it's all the more bothersome for role-playing that some options are still blocked behind the Paragon Renegade stats. But this time, instead of being based on skill points, it takes into account an overall percentage of the Paragon and Renegade options you took, leading to this weird effect of some choices being easier to handle if you do them earlier. And it's a pity that issues with the Paragon Renegade system still exist, as for the most part the dialogue wheel feels far better in Mass Effect 2 in terms of expectation and reality. While the wheel improvements don't benefit situations where the game is really keen on setting certain plot points, if there are cases where different options lead to the same voice line, then they're far more rare and pretty much not noticeable. This really helps the game's increased focus on interpersonal drama, which Mass Effect 2 pushes for the sake of its central concept: recruiting and building relationships with a team that at the end you'll take onto a suicide mission. And the character cast is definitely the best thing about Mass Effect 2. I was amazed how with such a huge roster of 12 squad mates, each has a distinct personality and character arcs they go through during recruitment and loyalty missions. And you get to know the team not just through their fantastically written quests and Normandy conversations, but also through simply putting them into your squad. Mass Effect 1 had your squad mates comment on what's happening sometimes, but Mass Effect 2 really doubles down on that. Even DLC characters are integrated to be active in the various missions.
If you start limping now, you might find a shady spot before you bleed out.
Shit. Oh, shit. Oh.
He just about pissed himself.
Some people need a heavy hand.
You get to really care about these people by the time you have to lead them into what is potentially their last assignment ever. The whole concept of the suicide mission is so ingenious, so focused on player agency, from who they recruit to how they develop relationships to what choices they make during the mission itself and before it, with so many outcome variables as even Shepard themselves may die. And look, maybe some of its implementation is not as elaborate as it could have been. Really, if you analyze it deeply, it boils down to completionism before the mission and common sense during it, but still, the tension is so palpable. Now, you might be wondering, even with some debatable stylistic changes in mind, why did I call Mass Effect 2 a failed sequel if I praise the gameplay, character writing, and the overall central concept? Don't these tackle all the Mass Effect 1 issues I've mentioned? Aren't these kinds of improvements what sequels should be about? If you judge the game by its Metacritic reviews, the answer is definitely yes. But we're not talking about a standalone sequel. Mass Effect promised to deliver a connected narrative spanning 3 games, with your choices having lasting consequences. With such a promise, it's pretty clear that on a broad conceptual level, the first game should handle the setup, second, progression and rise in stakes, and third, final resolution. For all its flaws, some of which do relate to pacing and writing, Mass Effect 1 handled its role absolutely masterfully by laying an insanely intricate world-building groundwork, introducing a seemingly impossible power to defeat, the Reapers, but also leaving open a number of narrative threads that give hope of success. At the end of the first game, Shepard vowed to find out how to stop the Reapers, thus defining a clear role for the second part to play, so the third one could focus on actually thwarting the threat. And Mass Effect 2 just ignores that role completely. Not only does it not progress anything, in the grand scheme of things it actually takes several steps back. And the game's central concept, the suicide mission, is at the core of the problem. I can't help but wonder why it wasn't saved for Mass Effect 3, where it would have been a perfect fit. But when being put in the middle, the suicide mission creates a set of huge problems that Mass Effect 2 itself has to also solve. First, obviously you can't go on a suicide mission to defeat the Reapers, those have to be taken care of in Part 3, so Mass Effect 2 introduces a new threat to defeat instead, the Collectors. Though technically they are sort of connected to the Reapers, the main antagonists are still sidelined. Then, since any member of the squad can potentially die at the end of the game, this means that there are too many variables for Mass Effect 3 to take into account, so none can have too big of a role there. Respectively, a bunch of new characters have to be introduced while explaining why most people from the first game, with a couple of exceptions, wouldn't be available as squad mates and allies. This is why, even though at the end of Part 1 everyone wanted Shepard to find how to deal with the Reapers, suddenly nobody actually believes in them anymore. One of the Citadel Council members who deceived them in the first game even uses Turian air quotes to mock us.
Ah yes, Reapers. The immortal race of sentient starships allegedly waiting in dark space. We have dismissed that claim.
You can't have a suicide mission and a Reaper information gathering mission at the same time. A big part of Mass Effect focused on finding the cipher required to comprehend the language of the extinct Prothean race, thus recontextualizing the entire knowledge base of the galaxy. Mass Effect 2 doesn't even mention it since it's outside of the narrative focus. And then, to create distance between us and the original crew and allies, Mass Effect 2 destroys Normandy and kills Shepard at the very beginning of the game. But since it still needs both, they get resurrected and rebuilt with cybernetic implants and leather chairs.
And leather seats! Military may set the hardware standard, but on a first-gen frigate they could care less if the seats breathe. Civilian sector comfort by design.
The whole prologue sequence is exceptionally exciting, but also ultimately inconsequential, as nobody, not even Shepard themselves, contemplate much on what it means to be literally back from the dead. In fact, that's used for humor more often than anything.
Shepard, but you're dead. I got better.
And I get why. Killing Shepard was never the point, it was just a way to accommodate for the suicide mission. To make sure that the old allies aren't all too eager to join it anyway, Cerberus becomes responsible for resurrecting Shepard and will work with them as a result. In Mass Effect 1, Cerberus was introduced as a human terrorist organization with a history of unethical science experiments. Shepard now being related to them is a valid reason to not join. But at the same time, our protagonist can't simply work for the bad guys, so Mass Effect 2 reimagined Cerberus into a pro-human collective with separate independent cells and a massive intel network, while sidelining the already established factions with galactic importance like the Shadow Broker to a set of exhilarating, but again ultimately inconsequential DLC missions. And look, undeniably there have been stylistic changes that influenced the tone and priorities. Mass Effect 1 would never put a charismatic chronic smoker sitting in the shadows near a window overlooking a giant sun as a leader of Cerberus, while Mass Effect 2 does exactly that. In Mass Effect 1 you could spend 5 minutes talking just about how engines of the Normandy worked, while Mass Effect 2 basically handwaves a human resurrection as tons of complicated science that took 2 years. But it's not the style shift that's responsible for Mass Effect 2 abandoning the narrative hook of Mass Effect 1 while not preparing anything meaningful for Mass Effect 3. It's a necessity created by using the suicide mission in the middle of the trilogy. And as much as Mass Effect 2 tries to distract from that with its focus on amazing characters, The irony is that all the game's best moments and missions are rooted in lore and subplots established in Mass Effect 1 with the possibility to influence Mass Effect 3. Mordin is amazing not just because of his fast-talking speech style and the whole deadly sociopathic but caring doctor personality, but also because you really get to see him grapple with the effects of the Krogan genophage and his involvement in it.
Genophage modification project altered millions of lives, then saw results. Ego, humility, juxtaposition, frailty of life, size of universe. Explored religions after work completed. Different races. No answers. Many questions.
And the choices in his loyalty mission advance not just his personal arc, but the respective subplot as well. Sure, Legion is an interesting companion on their own, but what really makes them fascinating is the fact that they're Geth and all the baggage that comes with that from the first game. The choice at the end of their mission is difficult because you really have to wonder what effect it will have both on the Geth and their relationship with organic nations. Tali's loyalty mission can hit hard not just because of an effective courtroom setup and a big focus on dialogue, but also because we finally get to see the Quarian migrant fleet up close and how Tali's trial is about more than just her personal fate. Even self-contained DLCs like Overlord leave a strong impression not just because of their depiction of autistic people being stereotyped and abused, but also examines the thought process behind unethical Cerberus experiments while setting up hooks for the future. Sure, the personal missions from the likes of Miranda, Jack, Thane are all interesting too, but those arcs don't leave as big of an impact because they're just localized to those people specifically. Which I guess Mass Effect 2 sort of wants? The more impact a character will have, the more reason they have to return in Mass Effect 3, and due to the complexity of suicide mission outcomes, the game clearly wants to minimize that. At the same time, it's not like Mass Effect 2 makes the job of its sequel easier in any way. Mass Effect 3 not only has to deal with 2 games worth of narrative now, but also somehow resolve all the stuff that Mass Effect 2 has introduced, like the increased importance of Cerberus and whatnot. And while Mass Effect 2 does handle some consequences of Mass Effect 1 choices with extra character appearances and emails, so many more are left on the shoulders of 3. This is why Mass Effect 2 is a failed sequel. But it's also a really great game with a Metacritic rating of 88. It's an emotional roller coaster. It's endearing, it's tense, it's funny, it's sad, it's full of action but not devoid of contemplation. It's so great at what it does, but also what it does is absolutely not what the Mass Effect trilogy needed. It just sits in self-indulgence, knowing that it can be loved without having to bear the responsibility for the mess it has created. I know some may think it's weird that I greatly enjoyed Mass Effect 2, but also criticize the hell out of it for its decisions. But I don't see any contradictions with that. After all, games and enjoyment are not binary in nature. You can enjoy something and yet still see and even accept its flaws. When I finished Mass Effect 2 for the first time, I had 2 thoughts. The first one was how much I enjoyed it. The second one was, holy shit, I can't believe how responsible and devious this game was. Because whatever happens, its hands are clean. Because now, if Mass Effect 3 fails to deliver, that's the fault of Mass Effect 3, which we'll discuss in the next video.